what's family? Again, how much is it defined by biology? What is ethnicity? How much is it defined by experience versus biology? If you have a revelation that the two are not the same.
Welcome to DNA Clarity and Support. I'm your host, Brian. Listen as I chat with authors and leaders in the DNA world about the family and personal impacts of DNA testing. You'll hear news stories, unique perspectives, find out about books, websites, organizations, other podcasts for those involved in the world of DNA. Please be sensitive to younger listeners as the conversations can get intense at times. This is a production of Watershed DNA. Learn more at watersheddna.com. I'm so excited to have you here today, Libby. Libby Copeland is the author of The Lost Family, How DNA Testing is Upending Who We Are. And Libby's going to talk with us today a little bit about how her book came to be, what parts of her own family history influenced what she wrote about in the book, and her thoughts on this whole notion of consumer DNA testing and how it's changing almost our understanding of what family means. So thanks for joining us.
I'm so happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yay. So your book came about really from an article that you wrote for the Washington Post about Alice Playbook. And do you want to tell us a little bit about the story of Alice and how you realized that her story was really needed to become a book?
Yeah, so I set out looking for a story that would kind of in miniature tell a bigger story. And this was back in 2017. I was in conversation with my editor at the Washington Post. I write about science and human behavior and sort of motivation, and particularly interested in what informs our sense of identity, what causes us to act in the ways we do, why do we think of ourselves the way that we think of ourselves? So those kind of questions of the social sciences. And we were really interested in this idea that DNA testing that's engaged with in a kind of recreational context, this is going to be entertainment, you buy it because it's on sale, you get it as a gift for the holidays, that you are spitting into a vial and you don't kind of realize the profundity of the decision that you're making. And that in some cases, you are discovering something that you never would have, set out to find, a kind of a question that you never have thought to pose to yourself. A question like, am I genetically related to the man I consider dad? Or are there aspects to my mother's history that I don't know about? Before she married my dad, did she have a child? And I now have this older half sister. And these are revelations that are coming to people sometimes in their 30s, but sometimes in their 50s and 60s and 70s, sort of in middle age or towards the end of a life, and they're causing people to kind of question and look back and rethink their whole lives, the trajectory of their lives. So I went looking for maybe a few stories that could tell this, and I wound up finding one story that was pretty unique and unusual. But what appealed to me about it, in addition to the fact that it was just incredibly compelling, it's a kind of an existential whodunit with lots of twists and turns, this story of Alice. What was interesting to me was that it contained within it other stories, because Alice, who tested back in 2012, expecting to find herself to be of almost entirely Irish ancestry, she discovers that she is half Ashkenazi Jewish. So, the term for Jews who come from Central and Eastern Europe, who have a unique genetic signature that's, of course, very different from someone who has Irish ancestry. And after her initial sense that this must surely be mistaken, and her initial investigations that confirmed that the test was not mistaken and that it was, in fact, she who had her story wrong, after that, she set out on a kind of a methodical journey of scientific inquiry during which she eliminated theory after theory. And so each theory that she had to explain her situation turned out not to be the explanation. But what interested me about that was that each theory provided the opportunity to look at the more common explanations for DNA surprises, because she went through them all. She went through the possibility that she was the product of an NPE for non-paternity event or not parent expected, or some people refer to it as MPE for misattributed parentage experience. That is one of the most common types of surprises within the world of DNA surprises that people are getting from consumer genetic testing. And of course, if you find out that your ethnicity estimate pie chart that you get from a DNA test is half unexpected ancestry, it's a good contender. A good contender of an explanation is going to be that one of your parents, most likely your dad, is not genetically related to you. So of course, Alice investigated it, but it turned out not to be the explanation in her case. It also turned out not to be the case that she was adopted, which was another theory she had. She was not donor conceived, which could have provided an explanation for the situation, but didn't in her case. And another theory that she explored was this possibility that she came from people who had hidden their genetic ancestry. And you certainly hear those stories coming out now in this era of genetic reckoning. So this is, places where our personal DNA tests kind of intersect with history in this really fascinating way. They may be stories of people who come from somebody who was a very light-skinned African American who made the choice to pass as white to escape rampant discrimination. And that knowledge was intentionally not passed down or sort of forgotten over the course of generations. And it's now in this moment when people are spitting into vials that they're making that discovery. You're also seeing stories of people who have genetic ancestry that's Jewish, and they descend from folks who converted or assimilated their way out of those identities, and again, didn't pass down that knowledge. So Alice investigates that theory. It turns out not to be the case. And the explanation for her situation is somewhat more unusual and goes back 100 years. It's kind of a fascinating explanation that allowed me to do some historical research. But what I loved about being able to tell that story for the Washington Post, and then I told it more fully in the book, was this idea that her tale contained within it so many others.
Right. And the ending of Alice's story is something I don't want to spoil for listeners because it really is a fascinating story to hear all the aspects of it. So I will put the link to the article in the Washington Post in the show notes, and it's explored more fully in your book. But I think you did an excellent job of addressing what's really, science and DNA can be very jargony and very technical. And I understand how hard it is as a genetic counselor to communicate complex scientific information in a way that makes sense to the general audience. I want to commend you on the job that you did of taking what's really complex and making it accessible to everybody, because that's a really hard feat to do.
Well, I, for better or worse, don't have a science background. And I kind of recognized early on when I was writing the proposal for the book, and then when I started reporting, that I had, bitten off the tiniest bite of an elephant that I was now going to attempt to digest in the form of a book, right? I was like, holy wow, this is a big job. And because I really, again, don't have a science background, when I was on the phone with scientists, I would have to ask them the same question several times over, repeat back what they said, and then repeat it back one more time just to be sure I understood. And then I would often follow up with an email saying, so I think what I heard you saying was this, but do I have it right? And sometimes I would have it right, and sometimes they would correct me. And then the process of writing it, once I had sections written, I was sending them to people with scientific knowledge. And some cases, that was the scientists I interviewed. In some cases, that was you. Right. You fact-checked them lengthy sections of the book for me, where I was just, trying to make sure. And I knew that you had the knowledge. And I, at that point, and, I just could not be sure. Sometimes there are words that we use as lay people that means something completely different in the scientific world. And as a layperson, you don't even know what you don't know. So I was always very nervous about that. And then when the book was done, I sent it to a geneticist, somebody who has a PhD in genetics, and she kindly read the entire book for me and made notes and said, this is not quite right. This is a better way of explaining it. I will forever be incredibly grateful to her. So it was definitely, something where I had to be aware of the things that I didn't know.
You did a great job of that. And I understand why your book was named one of the best books of 2020 by the Guardian newspaper. I think that was an acclaim that was definitely well deserved just based on, your combination of journalism skills to this complex topic. And I was happy to be involved in answering your questions and helping you get clear on even minute details like the difference between the word mutation versus variant, and
yes,
how different audiences would react or receive the information based on whether you use mutation or variant. And that is something that in every niche has its own language and its own terminology and its own acronyms. And you've made it possible for people that this whole notion of DNA testing and family surprises or family secrets, there are acronyms that people have to learn for the first time. And you wrote about it really naturally in a way that makes it accessible.
Well, thank you. That means so much. I really, really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
So how much of your own family history and looking back at your family's past influenced what you were most drawn to cover in the book? And did you find yourself exploring your own family history more or looking at it in a different light as you were writing the book and even now?
Yeah. So my dad's been doing genealogical work since the 80s, since the times when you would have to write letters to clerks far, far away and hope that they would respond to your query, like actual snail mail letters. And both of my parents had done DNA testing and had done a little bit of research by the time I started getting interested in the topic. But the writing of the book coincided with a kind of a genealogical explosion for our family. So all of a sudden, now that we were all in the database and many of us were kind of researching the genealogy, we started, and more people started joining the databases, which is a really key thing. Sometimes you can get a breakthrough because all of a sudden a cousin shows up, and until that cousin shows up, you just don't have that information. And so we started finding really interesting family members, and we were able to recreate or, better understand some aspects of our family history along both sides, which was pretty amazing. So on my dad's side, he was very close to his grandmother, who was Swedish. She emigrated from Sweden in the 1890s as a teenager. And there is a branch of the family in Sweden we wouldn't have known existed, but for DNA, because there was kind of a break in the line, an NPE. And once we connected with this family, because one of their members had decided to do a DNA test, even though in Sweden it's not nearly as popular as it is here, but she happened to be a genealogist. We connected with them and we got incredible information, and we decided to go to Sweden and meet our cousins. And she hooked us up as well with a local historian who was able to show us the landscape of the world where my dad's grandmother lived. So the foundation of her farmhouse, the school that she attended, the church where she worshiped. Some of the old desks from her school were still there with signed graffiti. Like kids would scratch their names into the underside of the desk. And we started going around pulling up the desks to see if on the underside she had ever done graffiti, but she didn't. At least not on the desk that we were able to find. And we were able to meet our cousins. I mean, it was absolutely extraordinary. This was in late 2019, so shortly before it became impossible to travel. That was an incredible gift. On my mom's side, we found that she has a second cousin who survived in Ukraine as Ashkenazi Jews throughout the history of the 20th century, which is pretty amazing. We didn't know that this branch of the family existed or had survived. These are people who would have survived pogroms and the Holocaust and the USSR. So basically everything that the 20th century had to throw at them, they survived. And this particular descendant went to Israel and then came to New York.
Oh my gosh.
And again, we would not have known about this but for DNA.
And are there living descendants in New York or other parts of the U.S. now?
Yeah, we spoke with my mom's second cousin. He was in Brooklyn on the phone.
That is pretty amazing. Did he have any idea that your branch of the family existed, or had there just been such schism with everything? I don't think he knew. My mom's grandfather had come to the new country and had never spoken of the past. So my mom, I think, did not know that there were siblings left behind, who those siblings might have been, the fate of those siblings. And, he passed away before she was old enough to ask those kinds of questions. So that was kind of a black box that, again, would not have come into our possession, so to speak, without DNA testing.
But you asked me about, how my personal genealogical search sort of affected my thinking about the book. I would say in a number of ways. I mean, on the one hand, the demonstration of the immediacy of the past was what hit me over and over as our family was doing genealogical research, just how these things aren't over, right? We carry the truth about the past in many ways inside of us. And we happen to live in this unique moment when you can test and you can find out. And you can find out, again, sometimes the answers to questions you never thought to ask. And you don't know what you're going to find until you test. And so that I found an incredible kind of revelation, was just how present the past is in our current day and how it informs our knowledge of ourselves and even our forward trajectories. So it influences even the future. It influences us whether or not we know it's there, but once you discover it, can really change how you think about yourself. And the other thing that I thought about a lot when I was writing the book is not only how influential our DNA is in self-conception, but also how it is so very much not the full story. You are not your pie chart. And while that pie chart can be incredibly informative and it can open up alleys of investigation and it can give you access to information you wouldn't have had, at the same time, your experiences are incredibly important. And the culture that you grew up in is incredibly important. And so the ways that we define ourselves, our understanding of our ethnicity, is not the same as your ethnicity estimate. And I think about that a lot as somebody who is half Ashkenazi Jewish through my mother, and through my father, I'm British and German and Swedish. So this kind of mix. And while I'm very close to both my parents, I really identify as Jewish in a way that is much more than 50%. And I pass that on to my children in a way that is much more than the quarter that they are, genetically speaking. And that's, for me, a kind of a cultural affiliation more so than a religious one.
And what that gets to really is that DNA can be part of someone's identity, but identity is built of many different things.
Right.
It's built of experiences and history and family connections. And that's something that comes up in discussions within the Watershed DNA Mighty Network, the support group and forum that I run. Does DNA automatically make somebody family? Or is there something else that is required for somebody else to be your family member? Is somebody who is a stranger to you but shows up in your DNA match list as your daughter or son or full sibling that you didn't know existed, are they automatically family, or is there more to it?
I mean, these are such profound questions that I think very few people expected to need to answer on an individual basis, right? This is stuff that previously, in many instances, people wouldn't have had to think about. It's the stuff that philosophers write about. It's the stuff that bioethicists write about. And now
people's real lives.
And now there are millions of consumers who are millions of Americans and people elsewhere who are grappling with these very essential human questions that I think go back, far back in history for as long as we're human, right? What's family? Again, how much is it defined by biology? What is ethnicity? How much is it defined by experience versus biology? If you have a revelation that the two are not the same. And there's a lot of work by social scientists kind of cautioning us against genetic essentialism, this idea that we conflate our identities with our genetics and that nothing else matters. But what I found is that the people that I interviewed resolved these questions with great nuance and complexity. They did not simply shuffle one identity in for another. They didn't say, everything that happened through the 50 years of my life doesn't matter, and now this new guy's my dad. They over and over would answer these questions in a kind of more capacious and emotionally generous way, particularly if this was questions about themselves and they had some sort of agency over the process, some sense of autonomy where they felt empowered. They often would say, there's a term from improv, yes and. Yes, this man is dad, and yes, this man is my biological father. And now let me figure out my relationships with them, let alone the language I'm going to use.
And the process itself takes time. That's something that comes up a lot in discussions, that at the beginning of a discovery, it feels like a crisis or an emergency. that, especially for the identified biological family that maybe didn't even know there was this other biological child that existed in the family, they feel a sense of urgency to do something about it. And so there is kind of an overwhelming, sometimes panic, sometimes shock, the doubt, denial. All of those are just part of a process that is normal, but to people who are early on in it and don't realize that what they're going through, thousands and possibly millions of other people have gone through before them, it is such almost like a crisis situation. And there's really not a lot of guidance or support or knowledge about what's the right next step in that process.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's why the work that you're doing is so important and so sort of innovative, because there's just not that much out there. And you've been working on this for years in a really prescient way, kind of knowing that there needs to be support for these folks and scaffolding for them and validation for their experiences and normalization. Because again,
right.
So many people go through similar experiences, but they don't know. And sometimes there's some sense of guilt or embarrassment about sharing those stories because they do feel so private. They maybe inform you about the life of a parent that you didn't know about. And maybe that doesn't even feel like something you're permitted to share with other people.
Right. When does somebody else's secret become open knowledge? And it's the truth. It can be the truth, but how does that truth unroll through a family? Who should be the first to know? How does that get transmitted? These are really complex questions that people are dealing with. And the DNA testing can reveal changes to the family history of the past. It's almost more pressing when it's impacting living people today.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
This discussion has been great today, Libby. I hope that the listeners who have not yet read your book will seek out a copy of it and also look for that article in the Washington Post. That's kind of the first version of Alice's story. So where would you recommend readers go to get a copy?
So you can, of course, buy the book on Amazon, which is a lot of people do for convenience. I've also been promoting a site called bookshop.org, which works with independent bookstores all over the country, and they will ship it to you. You don't have to live near the particular bookstore that's going to ship it to you. You just go on there. It's as simple as buying from Amazon. It may cost a few bucks more, but you are keeping a physical bookstore open. And I think that's a really important thing to do during this pandemic. If you want signed copies of the book, I do work with a bookstore that's not too far from my house. It's called the Village Bookstore, and it's in Pleasantville, New York. And you can just Google Village Bookstore, Pleasantville, New York, and call them up. And they have copies of the book. They will call me. I'll go over and sign it. So I can sign it for you. I can sign it for someone else if you want to give it as a gift. And I'm really happy to be working with them and supporting them and making that available because I can't do book signings. So it's my way of scratching my itch is by signing books in the store.
I look forward to the times when we can all leave our homes and travel throughout the world. And I look forward to seeing you in person at a book event in the future. I'm sure this is just the start of a very long career for you in excellent journalism and writing and publication. So I will put the bookstore information down in the show notes. And also, do you have a website that people can visit?
I do. It's libbycopeland.com. So LIBBYCOPELAND. And I have a newsletter on there. And so one thing I'm doing is telling stories through the newsletter. I mention upcoming talks. I also, when I have columns, which I continually write about this topic, I put them in there and I have special offers. So I give away free books on occasion. So if you sign up for the newsletter, your email doesn't go to anyone other than me. You can get more information there.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
Thank you for listening to this episode of DNA Clarity and Support. This is Brian Kirkpatrick. Check out the show notes for information discussed in today's episode and head over to watersheddDNA.com to sign up for our email list. Never miss out on notification of new resources available in the world of DNA testing. Thanks for listening to today's episode of DNA Clarity and Support podcast. Head on over to watersheddDNA.com to learn more about the resources and support available for those involved in DNA discoveries.